What's up, everybody? So I want to talk about the 6.1 liter Hemi. It's one of my all-time favorite engines, whether Ford, Chevy, it doesn't really matter. That engine is such a good-looking engine, makes tons of torque and 425 horsepower. What's not to love about that? I mean, Dodge engines hadn't seen horsepower like that out of a V8 since the late 60s, early 70s with the Gen 2 426. And when they put that 425 horsepower into a car that looked as good as the 2008 SRT8 Challenger, it was an instant win, instant success, not only from an engineering standpoint, but just from a marketing point of view. That car and that engine with that horsepower rating, out of the woodwork, it drug old school and new school Mopar enthusiasts alike. So just that alone, being able to set the stage and bring the brand into the modern era, puts that 6.1 liter on a bit of a pedestal as far as I'm concerned. Now, what makes that engine cool? Well, fixed intake manifold, no variable intake up there to change things up, no variable camshaft either. This engine makes power the old-fashioned way. Suck, squeeze, bang, blow, and don't worry about any of the gadgets and gizmos that these modern engines have. And because of that, it builds power and it makes power in kind of an old school way, being peaky through the mid-range, just like the old school muscle cars from back in the day. It's what made those cars so endearing when they were first released onto the scene. Again, add to that the aesthetics of the thing, and it is a surefire winner. And the weird thing about it, though, is the fact that it does seem to be a little bit forgotten. And again, without that engine, we don't have the Eagle, we don't have the 6.4 liter or any of the Hellcat variants that came after it. So why is it so forgotten? Well, it was so much forgotten mainly because the aftermarket didn't pay much attention to that engine. But then again, it's kind of hard to mess with perfection, right? The car does have a little bit of a tighter lobe separation in the camshaft, checking in at about 115 degrees, whereas most newer cars were checking in at about 118 to 121, which means that the 6.1 liter does do well and reacts well to long tube headers, or at least better than its 6.4 liter later derivatives. Now, when it comes to modifications, there really never was anything that came from the aftermarket. Intake manifolds, there wasn't a big camshaft offering for that car. Guys really weren't upgrading those cars, mainly because, well, the car did so well in stock form. The camshaft was kind of already a performance camshaft, and getting a whole lot more power out of that thing meant that you'd be sacrificing low-end torque, which is what you needed to get that big old car, that Challenger or Charger that you're driving, or later on the Cherokees and the like. You needed that torque to get those heavy vehicles moving. So camshafts, they were a big improvement in some areas, but they didn't really improve the torque down low, and that's one of the areas that you needed. So not a lot of love from the aftermarket there, and of course not a lot of love from the aftermarket from the intake manifold. That intake manifold's already good looking and it performed very well. So about the best you could hope for would be maybe some port matching or extrude honing of that upper intake manifold, and well, that would be about it for the performance modifications to that car. Again, most guys didn't modify them because to get that engine, you had to spend a lot of money. Why don't you consider this? In 2010, 2011, when the LS3 variants of the Camaro started showing up, the Camaro SS, the car was costing, talking about the Camaro now, $33,000, $35,000, where SRT variants, in other words, 6.1 liter powered cars, were checking in at $44,000 to $46,000 and up. That means that you had a car that was about 33% more expensive than an LS3 powered competitor, if you will. That's a whole lot of money. And so the guys that were buying Mopars, which this should ring fairly familiar to any of you guys that know anything about Mopar guys, they have a tendency to leave their cars stock. And yeah, a lot of guys will modify them, but remember that when these cars were new, they were very expensive and guys were buying them because of the performance that they offered as a stock car. it didn't really matter that you couldn't do a whole lot to them aside from some exhaust mods and things like that. There just wasn't a whole lot of takers for what the aftermarket would or eventually would not be offering, especially not like how they were offering them for the LS variants. And that's because there were so many more LS variants being sold. But it doesn't take away from the special nature of that 6.1 liter. Now, of course, later on, guys would start to modify them, and you'd go with the camshaft vent, you'd go with the ported intake manifolds, long tube headers, catbacks, and the like, and you can make some pretty serious power with the 6.1 liter. Let's not kid ourselves. The 6.1 liter, once it was cammed, ported heads, ported intake manifold, headers, and the like, stroker motors in some cases, they were putting down well over 525, 540 horsepower to the rear wheels, but that constituted a huge investment. Again, always seems to be a lot more expensive with the Mopars, and in this case, the 6.1 liter was definitely walking in lockstep. So, what are my thoughts about that engine now? Well, I'm a bit of a purist, and if I were to get my hands on something 6.1 liter powered, I would probably leave it alone and just enjoy it for the old school muscle car that it is. I appreciate the background of that car. I appreciate what it led into with the other higher power Hemi variants, but it's always been a little bit of a forgotten entity. And I know that for a lot of folks that are now looking at the 6.1 liter, they're looking at the 6.1 liter now as a vintage car. I mean, you got to remember, at the time of this video, we're looking at, you know, coming up on, I mean, not quite there yet, a couple of decades. I mean, yeah, 15, 14, 16 years after the fact, but I mean, we're coming up on a kind of a significant milestone for that engine. Guys are looking at it now as a, I don't know if you want to call it vintage, but definitely an old school approach to having fun with one of these cars. And with EVs being more and more prevalent, there are guys that are now looking to the past and looking to the 6.1 liter in the same respects that 20 years ago, guys were looking at 440 powered big block muscle cars of the era. So if you've got a 6.1 liter powered contraption, know that you've got a very special car. I know a lot of guys have modified them and blown them up, put them back together, and actually ended up going back to stock just because they missed the way that the cars ran from the factory. Again, fantastic engine. We wouldn't be where we are without him, and I can't wait to maybe one day get my hands on one myself. It is the car that really brought me back into Mopar, at least the V8 side of Mopar, so long ago, and it always warms my heart to see a really clean SRT8 ripping it up on the streets the same way that they were so long ago. And with that, I'm gonna wrap it up. Y'all have a great one. Adios.